France stands as Europe's most successful military power. Not England, not Prussia, not Rome. Statistically, France has won more wars on the continent than any other. And if this straightforward fact is twisted in the minds of millions who casually joke about the white flag, then how many other school-taught truths are actually just someone's invention? That's exactly where we'll begin. For a century and a half, people called him a usurper and a tyrant. Napoleon Bonaparte founded the French Bank, stabilized the currency, abolished serfdom in the territories he conquered, and wrote the Napoleonic Code. That very code became the foundation of civil law across nearly every European country. More precisely, not just most, but almost all of them. Germany, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, Poland, even Latin America. They all still follow legal principles shaped by this so-called tyrant. Yet in textbooks, he remains the conqueror. Why? Because those books were written by the ones who defeated him. Let's be honest, friends, we don't actually study history. We inherit conclusions made by others. Somewhere along the line, someone decided Napoleon was a villain, the French were cowards, and ancient people traded axes for animal skins. And we repeat it without questioning. But the moment you ask even one question, the familiar story begins to unravel. Here's a simple question: why do we believe it? The real question isn't why a specific myth has survived, but why the whole system keeps working. Why does a stereotype, created by an 18th century German historian chasing court favor, still thrive in the 21st century, when you can fact-check anything in 30 seconds? The answer is uncomfortable, because checking facts is boring, and a simple, neat story is convenient. The world gets divided into black and white, barbarians and the civilized, smart and dumb. Our brains love those categories. They save energy. And it's this very shortcut that has powered some of the most successful public relations campaigns in human history. Here's one of the best examples in my opinion. In ancient Egypt, they used a unit of account called the deben. It was a weight measure, 91 grams, divided into 10 parts. It wasn't a coin, nor a metal ingot. It was an abstract unit of value used to price goods, slaves, and services. A fully functioning monetary system without a single coin. Yet textbooks say, before money was invented, people traded goods directly. Barter, an axe for a cow. Simple and clear, but simply not true. Here's another example. When someone says pirates, most people picture the Caribbean, black flags, and parrots perched on shoulders. But the real golden age of piracy? It wasn't the 17th century. It took place during the Roman Republic. The Cilician pirates ruled the Mediterranean with a fleet of 1,000 ships and 30,000 sailors. 1,000 ships, that's more than most nations had back then. They weren't just stealing from merchants on the side. They waged full-scale wars against Rome. Yet good luck finding that in popular culture. Now remember one name, Rising Star Cave in South Africa. Hold on to it because we'll need it later. Deep inside a narrow crawl space, barely wide enough for an adult to squeeze through sideways, scientists found over 1,500 bones, at least 15 individuals. Not our ancestors, an entirely different species. Homo naledi. Creatures with brains the size of an orange, who apparently carried their dead deliberately into this chamber. A ritual burial. From a species we once denied the ability to think. And here's where it gets really interesting. Behind each of these myths, the barter system, cowardly France, primitive ancient humans, stands someone who benefits. A philosopher who needed to sell the idea of a free market. An empire determined to belittle its defeated enemy. An anthropologist defending the idea that our species is exceptional. History isn't a simple record of events. It's the most successful PR campaign ever launched. And the authors of that campaign are always the victors. But to truly grasp how deeply these lies have woven into everyday life, we have to start with something very simple. Something right now in everyone's pocket. Every introductory economics textbook starts off the same way. It begins with people trading axes for grain, then grain for animal skins. Eventually, they realized this system was clumsy, and so they invented money. It's a neat, logical story. A hunter visits a potter. The potter goes to a weaver. The weaver stops by a baker. Everyone brings something different, each looking for the one who needs exactly what they have. But here's the catch. The hunter needs a pot, but the potter doesn't want meat. This is what's called the double coincidence of wants. To solve it, humanity supposedly created money. Axe for coin, coin for pot. Progress. Everyone who's cracked open a school textbook has heard this story. It's so deeply ingrained that it feels obvious, natural, like gravity. But historians find no evidence that barter ever came before money. Not a single shred. In fact, many researchers argue that what we think of as barter is a modern invention, something that appeared only after people were already used to using money. Barter popped up during crises, when monetary systems broke down. Simply put, barter did not give birth to money. It showed up when money stopped working. Exactly the opposite. Let's take a step back, way back to Mesopotamia, 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. Sumer, Uruk, Babylon. City-states with temple complexes, irrigation systems, and bureaucracies that would put many modern cities to shame. These civilizations left behind thousands of clay tablets, small rectangular pieces of baked clay covered in cuneiform script. They contain records of debts, who owed what to whom, when it would be repaid, under what terms. Thousands of these tablets exist, but records of barter deals? Zero, not a single one. People meticulously tracked every debt, yet never once wrote down, exchanged 2 sacks of barley for a goat. How is that possible? But within the community, direct trade simply wasn't necessary. Anthropologist David Graeber and sociologist Marcel Mauss, working with completely different sources, one with field data from Polynesia, the other with early 20th century ethnography, arrived at the same conclusion. Most ancient societies operated on 2 core principles: gift and debt. A gift isn't just a birthday present, it's a systemic way to distribute resources. On the Takilau Atoll in the Pacific Ocean, the Inati system still operates. The entire fish catch gets shared among all the village residents. It's not sold or traded, just divided. On Anuta Island, there's a system called a ropa, where families share their harvest. It's like a social safety net, without insurance policies or managers. You give today because you trust someone will give back tomorrow. Relationships inside the community form a web of mutual obligations, not a marketplace. Debt worked in a similar way, but with a record-keeping system. And here we circle back to those very clay tablets. The temple would lend grain to the farmer. The farmer had to pay it back after the harvest. If they didn't, the debt was rewritten, and interest piled up. Sound familiar? This was essentially the prototype of a bank loan, only instead of a bank, it was the temple, and instead of an electronic statement, it was a palm-sized piece of clay. We have a record from ancient Egypt dating to the 19th dynasty. A slave woman was valued at 4 debens and 1 kiddet of silver. But the buyer didn't pay in silver. Instead, he brought a set of items: bronze vessels, clothing, honey. The total value of these goods was accepted as equal to the stated price. Notice this: the price was expressed in silver, even though no silver actually changed hands. Silver here was a unit of account, an abstraction, a baseline. This wasn't barter. It was already a system where value was measured through a virtual standard. But if barter didn't work within communities, does that mean it never existed at all? Not at all. Barter did exist, just not where textbooks usually place it. Historically, barter played a role in trade between different tribes and peoples who didn't share a common economic system. You don't know these people, and they don't know you. There's no debt between you, and there couldn't be. That's where exchange came into play. Often, it took the form of what's called silent barter, a practice described as far back as the 15th century. One party would leave goods at a designated border and leave. Then, the other party would arrive, inspect the goods, and place their own items nearby. If the first party was satisfied, they'd take the new goods and leave. If not, they left everything untouched, and negotiations continued without a single word exchanged. This wasn't the foundation of an economy. It was a diplomatic ritual between strangers. So where did the myth come from that barter is the foundation of all trade? Every myth has a specific author. The year is 1776, Scotland. Adam Smith releases The Wealth of Nations, a book that will become the cornerstone of economic thought for the next 2.5 centuries. Smith traces the origin of money back to barter, hunter, potter, baker, the classic chain that gets retold in every introductory economics lecture today. But here's the crucial part. Smith doesn't reference any particular society. He offers no archaeological evidence, no ethnographic records. Instead, he constructs a thought experiment and presents it as history. And he did it deliberately. In the 18th century, mercantilism was the dominant economic doctrine, a system where the government tightly controlled trade, set tariffs, restricted imports, and regulated prices. Smith needed to prove that the market could operate on its own without government oversight. To do that, he crafted a compelling origin story. Trading is a natural human behavior, and money is their own invention, not a tool of power. Barter, in this narrative, isn't a historical fact. It's an argument, an ideological pillar supporting the theory of a free market. By the 1850s, this framework had entered the first university courses in political economy. By the early 20th century, it became a standard part of school curricula across Europe and America. And by the 21st century, it transformed into an unquestioned axiom, something repeated without ever being challenged.
Today, it's easy to call Smith a myth maker, but in his time, anthropology as a science didn't exist. Mesopotamian tablets hadn't been deciphered yet. There were no field studies on gift economies. Smith worked with what he had: logic and imagination. The problem isn't that he was wrong. The problem is that his thought experiment outlived its own refutation and is still taught as fact. And here's what's hard to wrap your head around. The data exists. The tablets have been unearthed. Graeber published his research. Moss shared his findings. Yet open any introductory economics course, and the first chapter starts with the same old story: the hunter, the potter, the problem of double coincidence, as if the last 100 years of research never happened. If we've been so quick to get the basics of trade wrong, a question fundamental to our very nature, maybe it's time to take a closer look at other things where we assume we're the only ones on this planet. In 2013, Gauteng Province, South Africa. 2 cave explorers squeeze through a narrow gap barely 7 inches wide, just wider than an adult man's hand, and enter a chamber later named Dinaledi. In the Sotho language, Dinaledi means chamber of stars. Inside, they find bones. A lot of bones. Over 1,500 fragments belonging to at least 15 individuals. And this is where everything we thought we knew about ourselves starts to unravel. The first thing that stands out: the bones aren't scattered randomly. Not like the remains of creatures that fell by accident or were dragged in by predators. The bodies lie in a deliberate arrangement. There are no marks of predator teeth on the bones. No signs of water washing the remains away. This isn't a random pile, it's a burial. Someone intentionally carried the dead bodies here, hauling them through a 7-inch opening in complete darkness. Purposefully, deliberately, again and again. But wait, who exactly did this? Here, the official story of humanity begins to unravel. These bones don't belong to us, not Homo sapiens. They belong to Homo naledi, a species that lived in Africa 200,000 to 300,000 years ago. Their brain measured about 500 cubic centimeters. For comparison, ours ranges from about 1,300 to 1,400. So the Naledi brain was roughly the size of an orange. Ours, more like a small melon. That's nearly a 3-fold difference. Yet this creature, with a brain the size of an orange, practiced ritual burial of the dead. Ritual burial isn't instinct, it's abstract thinking. It's seeing death as something that demands a response. In a way, it's the spark of what we call culture. Now here comes the toughest pill for our ego. The earliest solid evidence of ritual behavior in Homo sapiens dates back only about 100 to 120,000 years ago. More precisely, these are burials found in the caves of Kafsa and Skul, located in what is now Israel. That means Neanderthals were burying their dead at least 80,000 years before us. Creatures with brains 3 times smaller came up with rituals long before our species even showed signs of symbolic thinking. How is that even possible? Let's go deeper, literally, into the very cave itself. Rising Star Cave, where the Dinaledi Chamber is located, is more than just a hole in the ground. It's a maze of limestone passages, with the temperature holding steady around 78 degrees Fahrenheit all year round. The humidity hovers near 100%. The air is thick and heavy, carrying the scent of wet stone and mineral deposits. In some places, the ceiling dips so low that researchers had to crawl, pressing their chests against the floor. And in these conditions, engravings appeared on the cave walls. Not just scratches, not random marks. Geometric shapes, intersecting lines, repeating patterns. Someone sat in total darkness by the light of a torch or a burning branch, carefully carving symbols onto the stone. Possibly the oldest symbols in history. Not just our history, but in the entire history of intelligent life on this planet. And here's another detail. The structure of Homo naledi's hands. Their fingers are curved, perfect for climbing trees. But the thumb? It's long, opposable, with a wide pad. Their wrists are rigid, just like ours. This is a hand built for delicate work, for grasping tiny objects, for using tools, for engraving. An animal that lived among the trees, then descended into dark caves to leave messages on the walls. Messages we still can't read 300,000 years later. It paints a strange picture. We tend to imagine evolution as a ladder. Primitive forms at the bottom, us at the top, each rung a step toward perfection. Homo naledi should stand near the bottom, early on the ladder. A small brain, an archaic body, a dead-end branch. But here's the twist. This dead-end branch buried its dead and possibly created symbols. Meanwhile, the so-called peak of evolution hadn't even been born yet. The idea that human reason follows a straight line of progress isn't a scientific fact. It's a comforting story we tell ourselves to justify our existence. We say, we're here because we're better, smarter, more complex. That nature selected us as the pinnacle of evolution. But evolution doesn't work that way. It's not the best who survive, not the smartest, not the strongest. Survival goes to whoever is best suited to the specific conditions at a specific time. And those conditions? They're often a matter of chance. A drought that lasted 300 years. A volcanic eruption that buried half a continent in ash. A plague that wiped out 90% of the population. Any one of these disasters could have wiped our species off the face of the earth and left behind the Neanderthals, or Homo erectus, or the Denisovans. If the climate had shifted just 5 degrees the other way, or if a single volcano had erupted 1,000 years earlier or later, then maybe, right now, a descendant of Neanderthals would be standing in this very cave, staring at our bones with the same wonder, wondering why this strange species with a disproportionately large skull never learned to bury its dead on time. We are not the crown of creation. We are just one of many versions that got lucky. More promising species might have gone extinct after one unlucky century, but we made it through. Not because we were objectively better, but because we happened to be in the right place at the right time with the right collection of random mutations. Here's what really haunts us. We so eagerly claim biological uniqueness, monopoly over intelligence, culture, rituals, even though evidence from South African caves tells a different story. So where else have we built myths like this? Where else have entire civilizations been written off as backward just because someone else penned their history? Sometimes a single wrong word, a name invented by an outsider, is enough to bury the true memory of a people for centuries. The year 1453, Constantinople. The last emperor steps onto the city walls, in a place his people call the capital of the Roman Empire. Not the Eastern Roman Empire, not Byzantium, just the Roman Empire, because, to them, no other empire existed. This is where things get confusing once you start digging deeper. The people we call Byzantines had no idea they were Byzantines. They called themselves Romans, Romaioi in their own language. Their empire was the Roman Empire. Constantinople was the new Rome. For a merchant from Antioch in the 9th century, a monk from Thessaloniki in the 12th, or a soldier standing guard on the walls that final spring, they were Rome, the direct continuation of the very state founded by Romulus and the she-wolf. Not a fragment, not an heir, Rome itself. So where did the word Byzantium come from?
Here's where it gets really interesting. This word was invented by a specific person, with a name and a last name. A German historian named Hieronymus Wolff. In 1557, 104 years after the empire had already ceased to exist, Wolff sat in Augsburg in an office piled high with manuscripts, facing the task of cataloging Greek texts from the eastern part of Rome. The problem was purely administrative. The Holy Roman Empire of the German nation was already around, and calling another state Roman caused confusion. It was a mess in the filing system. So Wolff took a simple approach. He borrowed the ancient name of the Greek colony Byzantium, the place where Constantinople was once built, and slapped that label onto an entire civilization, retroactively, onto a dead empire that couldn't argue back. More precisely, Voltaire only planted the seed. The real harvest came from someone else. By the 18th century, English historian Edward Gibbon had turned the word Byzantium into a widely accepted term in his monumental work, The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Gibbon portrayed the Eastern Romans as a degenerate shadow of the Great Rome, mired in intrigue and superstition. By the 19th century, this label had cemented itself in textbooks across Europe. By the 20th, it became an undisputed fact. A state that lasted for over 1,100 years was given a name it never knew. And with that foreign name came a foreign reputation. Backward, rigid, trapped in religious conflicts while the West moved forward. In my view, this stands as one of the most outrageous cases of historical misrepresentation, and you can verify it in 5 minutes just by comparing the numbers. Let's talk literacy. Documents from the 11th to 13th centuries found in monasteries on Mount Athos aren't literary masterpieces. They are practical records, wills, contracts, sales agreements. Yet they reveal something striking. 62 to 64% of the people who signed these documents could read and write. 62%. Now let's compare. In 14th century England, the time of Chaucer and the 100 Years' War, literacy hovered around 10%. In 15th century France, it reached only 19%. So in what we often label a backward state, 6 times more people could read than in England, the country we call progressive. 6 times more. And this wasn't Constantinople with its universities. These are provincial monastery archives. You'd think a society with this level of education would have made a mark in science and medicine. But the phrase, "you'd think," is for those who don't actually know what it left behind. In the 10th century, Byzantine general Kakavman, a military commander not a scholar, wrote instructions for his sons. Among practical advice on maintaining formation and conducting negotiations, he recommended specific textbooks on military tactics. Not vague calls to be brave or pray before battle, actual textbooks, with titles. The general compiled a reading list for his sons in the 10th century. Then, in the 11th century, Constantinople performed a surgery that would leave a modern surgeon breathless. They separated conjoined twins. One brother died, but the doctors, real medical practitioners, not priests or healers, decided to operate to save the other. In the 11th century, while Paris still relied on prayer and bloodletting, Constantinople cut into living flesh, armed with enough anatomical knowledge to attempt separating fused bodies. But there's one example that hits me the hardest, because its impact literally hangs on the wall in every home. The year was 1326. Byzantine scholar Nikephoros Gregoris took the Julian calendar, the very one the entire Christian world had followed for over 13 centuries, and proved it was wrong. An error had built up, days were shifting, Easter was drifting. Gregoris calculated the exact size of the discrepancy and proposed a reform. His calculations were precise, but Constantinople was already weakening, and the reform never took hold. 200 years passed. In 1582, Pope Gregory XIII introduced a new calendar, the Gregorian calendar, named after the Pope, of course, not the Byzantine mathematician who had done all the math 2 centuries earlier. Gregoris's calculations formed the foundation of this reform. The calendar we use today grew from the work of a scholar from a so-called backward empire. Yet his name was erased from this story, just like the empire's name itself. Here's what really unsettles me. It's one thing not to know about someone else's achievements, but it's another to erase them deliberately. To rename a civilization long after it's gone, to brand it a dark stain, then claim its discoveries as your own. This isn't just ignorance, it's a carefully planned strategy. And every strategy has a mastermind behind it. Someone in enlightened Europe found it very useful for the Eastern Roman Empire to appear as a mere shadow, not what it truly was, a state where generals read books, surgeons separated conjoined twins, and mathematicians calculated more precisely than the Pope himself. We know who commissioned it. We have a name, an address, and the number of copies. The year is 1748, Paris. Charles-Louis de Montesquieu, one of France's most influential thinkers, publishes his treatise, The Spirit of the Laws. 20 years of work, 31 volumes, a text that will reshape the political philosophy of Europe. And in this work, Montesquieu makes a move that will shape how an entire civilization views history for centuries. He takes Byzantium, a 1,000-year-old empire with universities, hospitals, and codified law, and turns it into a caricature. An example of what not to do when ruling a state. Despotism, religious fanaticism, decline, stagnation. Montesquieu never studied Byzantium deeply. He used it. He needed a counterexample, a boogeyman to scare French monarchists. Look, he warned, this is what happens when power is absolute and unchecked by parliament. The Eastern Roman Empire became a convenient target because no one was left to defend it. The empire had been gone for 300 years by then. The dead don't sue for libel. Montesquieu was not alone. Voltaire called Byzantine history a disgrace to human reason. Edward Gibbon, the author of the 6-volume Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, devoted hundreds of pages to the Eastern Roman Empire, and every one of them dripped with contempt. Simply put, the 3 most widely read authors of the 18th century, whose books sold by the thousands from London to St. Petersburg, each independently reached the same conclusion. Byzantium was shameful and dark. Was it a coincidence? No, it was an ideological campaign. Each had his own target. Montesquieu fought absolutism, Voltaire battled the church, and Gibbon attacked both at once. But they all shared the same weapon, dismissing an empire that united monarchy and Christianity to prove that this combination could only lead to decay. They weren't writing history. They were penning political pamphlets, using the past as a tool to argue their point to contemporaries. And this is where it gets really interesting, because when you dig into the actual Byzantine laws, not Voltaire's retellings, but the original texts themselves, the whole picture flips upside down. The year 529. Emperor Justinian finishes compiling a legal code that will go down in history as the Justinian Code. This wasn't just a collection of decrees, it was a system that clearly stated a principle unimaginable in what was called Eastern despotism. If an emperor's order contradicted the law, it could not be enforced. Montesquieu sits in Paris criticizing the tyranny of Eastern rulers, yet at the heart of the empire he condemned, the law stood above the ruler. It's like writing a scathing article about a country without a constitution,
when that country has had one for 12 centuries. In other words, Montesquieu criticized the empire for something it didn't have, while ignoring what was actually there. And the Justinian Code wasn't some secret text. It became the foundation of civil law across half of Europe. It was studied in Bologna, in Padua, in Paris. Yes, that very Paris where Montesquieu denounced Eastern despotism. He knew about this code, he just decided it was inconvenient for his argument. But first, let's take a step back and tackle another common stereotype: religious fanaticism. When most people think of the Byzantine Empire, they imagine endless prayers, icons, and theological debates. Monks, ascetics, darkness. But here's the thing. At the heart of Constantinople stood the Hippodrome. Not just a small arena, a colossal structure that could hold up to 100,000 spectators. 100,000. That's like packing 3 modern football stadiums to the brim. They held chariot races there, and the fans split into factions, the blues and the greens, with such fierce passion that in 532, a fan riot nearly toppled Emperor Justinian himself. This event is known as the Nika Revolt. Estimates say between 30,000 and 35,000 people died. And it wasn't about religion, it was about sports and politics. In Byzantine culture, Christian holidays peacefully coexisted with pagan traditions. They didn't burn the ancient works of Plato and Aristotle at the stake. Instead, they copied, commented on, and taught them. This wasn't an austere monastic world. It was a vibrant society, alive with theaters, bathhouses, hippodromes, universities, bustling marketplaces, and public libraries. Calling it dark is like calling an anthill empty just because you're looking at it from the 10th floor. And here, scattered pieces come together to form a single picture. When Constantinople fell to the Ottoman forces in 1453, the city flooded with refugees. Scholars, copyists, philosophers, artists, they fled westward to Italy, France, and the German lands. They carried more than their knowledge. They brought manuscripts, the very originals of Plato, Aristotle, Ptolemy, and Archimedes, preserved and copied by Byzantium for over 1,000 years, while Western Europe was just learning to build with stone again. By 1460, Greek scholars were already teaching in Florence. By 1480, they were translating ancient texts for the Medici family. By the early 16th century, these writings became the foundation of what we now call the Renaissance. The Renaissance didn't emerge out of nowhere. It was literally carried in suitcases, more precisely, in chests filled with manuscripts, by people from that so-called backward empire. Here's a paradox. The civilization that preserved the ancient heritage of Europe and sparked the Renaissance was later branded by Europe itself as a symbol of decline. Not because it deserved that label, but because 3 centuries after its fall, a few philosophers needed a convenient, frightening example to serve their political arguments. Montesquieu was fighting against Louis, but Justinian took the blame. And that might be the most sobering insight. Myths about the past rarely come from ignorance. They emerge from the specific interests of specific people living in their own present. Sometimes, just 3 influential writers and a couple of decades are enough to rewrite an entire millennium. And when someone controls access to technology or weapons, the distortion of history becomes even easier. Pause any Hollywood samurai movie for a moment. What do you see? Cherry blossoms, paper lanterns, and a warrior in armor slowly drawing a gleaming katana. The sword flashes, the enemy falls, honor is upheld. Beautiful, cinematic, and completely wrong. Because a real Japanese warrior in the 16th century was far more likely to be holding a musket than a katana. In 1543, a Chinese junk drifted ashore on the small island of Tanegashima, south of Kyushu. On board were 3 Portuguese men. They carried goods, diseases, and 2 matchlock guns, arquebuses. The local daimyo, the island's ruler, watched a shooting demonstration. He bought both weapons for an enormous sum and handed them over to his gunsmiths. Their mission was clear: take them apart, understand how they worked, and replicate them. And that's where the story gets fascinating. Japanese blacksmiths, masters who had spent centuries forging blades from layered steel, took just months to crack the design. Not years, months. The only hurdle was the threaded screw on the breech of the barrel, a technique unknown in Japan until then. But even that challenge was quickly overcome when another Portuguese ship arrived, bringing a craftsman ready to share the secret. By the late 1540s, Tanegashima was already producing firearms on a small industrial scale. Let me share this with you, my friends. This is the true measure of a civilization's progress. It's not how skillfully you wield your sword, but how quickly you can copy and scale up someone else's technology. 16th century Japan mastered this faster than many European powers. Now, the numbers. By the year 1592, when Toyotomi Hideyoshi sent a 180,000-strong army to invade Korea, 40,000 soldiers in that army carried muskets. 1 in every 4. Imagine walking into a stadium where every 4th person in your row is holding a rifle. For comparison, European armies didn't reach that level of firearm adoption until the 19th century, more specifically, the first half of that century. Japan was more than 200 years ahead of Europe. 40,000 barrels. Not bows, not swords, barrels. Here's a question few people ask. If the Japanese adopted firearms so early and on such a large scale, why does the world still associate samurai with the katana, not the musket? What happened to all those guns? The answer isn't about culture, it's not about philosophy, and it definitely isn't some disdain for barbaric technology, as many documentaries claim. The truth lies in politics, practical, calculated, and cold. At the dawn of the 17th century, the Tokugawa clan finally united Japan after a century of civil wars. The shogunate seized power. Their first move? They focused on how to keep it. Provincial lords, or daimyo, each with their own muskets, posed a direct threat. Every regional ruler with a gunpowder stockpile was a potential rebel. To stop that, Tokugawa established a government monopoly on firearm production. They didn't ban muskets outright, that would have been too harsh. Instead, they centralized production in a few workshops under the shogunate's strict control. Year after year, new gun orders dwindled. Old weapons broke down and were never replaced. Over several decades, Japan essentially disarmed itself, not because of cultural conservatism, but because the central government deliberately cut off the regions from military technology. This is exactly where the sword's aesthetic surged into the void. When muskets became out of reach, the katana stood alone as the warrior's symbol of status. Not because it was superior, not because it was nobler, but simply because there were no other options left. Let's be honest. What we now see as ancient samurai tradition, the blade cult, the meditative rituals of drawing the sword, all that beauty, is actually a product of the Tokugawa era. It was a deliberate technological rollback imposed for political control. The warrior who supposedly rejected gunpowder out of honor, in reality, just couldn't get his hands on it. To me, this is one of the most striking examples in world history. Aesthetics don't arise from inspiration, but from limitation. Take technology away from people, and within a few generations, they'll start glorifying its absence as a virtue. Hollywood grabbed onto a ready-made image. Kurosawa polished it until it shined. Anime sealed the deal. Now, try telling someone that a typical samurai from the Sengoku era didn't look like Tom Cruise wielding a sword. Instead, they resembled a European arquebusier, mud-caked, soaked in rain, reloading their matchlock rifle with wet hands. They won't believe you. The myth has grown too vivid to make room for the truth. But the myth of sword-wielding samurai is just a small part of a vast web of stereotypes about this country. Some of these myths touch on far deeper questions than weapons, like who actually lives on these islands and where they really came from. This country's land area is 20,000 square kilometers larger than Germany's. Its main island, Honshu, is about the size of 2 Portugals. When it comes to population density, the country ranks only 28th in the world. Not second, not 5th, 28th. Yet ask anyone on the street, and they'll tell you it's a tiny, overcrowded archipelago where people practically stand on each other's heads. Where does this image come from? From photos of Tokyo's subway during rush hour? From shots of Shinjuku, where crowds flow between skyscrapers like a river? The problem is, Tokyo is not the whole country. Judging the entire nation by Tokyo is like judging the United States by Times Square on a Friday night. 4/5 of the land is mountains, forests, and coastlines, stretching for miles without a single soul in sight. But the idea of a tiny, cramped Japan has already sunk deep into popular perception, and facts won't change that. Now, let's dig a little deeper. A homogeneous nation, one people, one bloodline, one culture, stretching back to time immemorial, right? Not even close. Long before the ancestors of modern Japanese set foot on these islands, entirely different peoples lived here. The Ainu ancestors, people with thick beards and broad faces, unlike either the Chinese or the Koreans. The ancestors of the Nivk, Austronesian tribes arriving from the south. These were the island's original inhabitants. The Yamato people, the very ones we call Japanese today, were settlers, migrants from the continent, most likely from China or Korea. Their last major migration wave ended in the 3rd century AD, so the so-called originally Japanese population were actually newcomers who gradually displaced and assimilated those who had lived on the islands long before. And this is where things get really interesting. Because these peoples never disappeared. The Ainu still live on Hokkaido. The Ryukyuan people are found on Okinawa and the nearby islands. They are recognized as a distinct group with their own language and culture. But here's the striking part. The Ainu were officially recognized as an ethnic minority only in 2019. Not in the 19th century, not after the war, in 2019. In other words, the government spent decades pretending these people simply didn't exist. Why? Because the myth of ethnic homogeneity isn't a mistake, it's a tool, and it works hand in hand with another tool, the artificially extended history. To understand this mechanism, we need to take a step back and examine how states build their genealogies. Official mythology claims the imperial dynasty dates back to the 7th century before the Common Era. It traces an unbroken line of rulers, from the goddess Amaterasu all the way to the current emperor. 2,600 years or more. It sounds impressive, but modern historians see things differently. Real statehood on the islands only took shape around the 3rd or 4th century of the Common Era. That's a difference of about 1,000 years. A whole millennium added retroactively to make the dynasty appear older than any other on Earth. This wasn't a unique tactic. Many did it, from the Romans to the Korean kings. But few pulled it off on such a grand scale. The same logic applies to the famous period of isolation. The era known as Sakoku, when Japan shut itself off from the outside world, began in 1639. It lasted nearly 200 years. 200 years is a long time in a human life, but in the grand sweep of a nation's history, it's just a brief chapter. Before Sakoku, the islands had been part of a vast exchange network for centuries. By the 5th century, Buddhism arrived from the continent and transformed spiritual life. By the 10th century, Chinese characters formed the basis of Japanese writing. Then, in the 16th century, Portuguese explorers appeared, bringing muskets, Christianity, and bread, which the Japanese still call pan, borrowed from Portuguese. For most of its history, Japan eagerly absorbed foreign technology, religions, and ideas. Then, for 2 centuries, the gates closed, and that very episode came to define an entire civilization. But wait, while geographic and ethnic myths often serve internal agendas, there's one myth that satisfied everyone, both the victors and the defeated. August 1945. The usual story is simple. The United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the sheer devastation forced the emperor to surrender. The war was over. It all sounds logical, straightforward, but the timeline doesn't quite add up. Hiroshima was destroyed on August 6th. Nagasaki followed on the 9th. 3 full days passed between the 2 bombings, and during those 3 days, the military council didn't meet. There was no panic at headquarters, no emergency meetings. The Army command saw the atomic bomb as just another form of large-scale bombing. Terrifying, yes, but not fundamentally different from the firebombing raids that had already scorched Tokyo in March that year. On that single night, more than 100,000 people died, yet no one even mentioned surrender.
What changed?
On August 9th, the very day the bomb fell on Nagasaki, the Soviet Union declared war and launched an offensive in Manchuria. The Kwantung Army, the last strategic reserve, was crushed in a matter of days. Plans for a prolonged defense, hopes for negotiations through Moscow, and attempts to bargain for better terms all collapsed at once. It wasn't the bomb that killed hope. It was the Second Front. Here, we don't need historians' interpretations. We need the words of the man who made the decision. On August 17, 1945, Emperor Hirohito spoke not to the people, but to the military. In that speech, he directly named the Soviet Union's entry into the war as the decisive factor that forced him to accept surrender. Not the bombs, not the destruction, the geopolitical reality. But no one was satisfied with that explanation. The United States needed to justify using nuclear weapons, and the story that the bomb ended the war fit perfectly. Japan had to save face. Surrendering to a weapon that couldn't be defended against seemed far more honorable than admitting they were simply trapped in a strategic vice. The Soviet Union didn't care. Their propaganda pushed a different narrative. In the end, both sides of the conflict had a stake in the same simplified version of events, each for their own reasons, each benefiting in their own way. In other words, the lie wasn't imposed by the victor on the defeated. It was built together because the truth was uncomfortable for everyone at once. Here's something interesting. This mechanism, when a story benefits both sides, doesn't just play out in global politics. It shows up everywhere reputation is on the line. Even among those who seemed to live outside all rules, pirates prowling the open seas. The 1st century before the Common Era. The Mediterranean teems with ships, yet trade vessels sit idle in the ports. No one sets sail. Rome, the world's greatest power, struggles to bring grain to its own capital. The cause? Cilician pirates. Not just a ragtag band on flimsy boats, but a fleet of 1,000 ships dominating sea lanes all the way from Syria to Gibraltar. Plutarch described them as flamboyant showmen, gilded sails, silver oars, purple canopies shading their decks. They didn't just rob, they humiliated. When they captured a proud Roman who declared his citizenship, the pirates would ceremoniously present his toga and sandals, only to toss him overboard with the same mock respect. One such prisoner was a young Julius Caesar. They ransomed him for 20 talents of silver, about half a ton of metal. Caesar, offended by the low price, insisted they raise it to 50 talents. That was the cost of reputation. Here's where the first disconnect appears. What we're used to seeing on screen doesn't tell the whole story. Hollywood has locked piracy to the Caribbean. Palm trees, rum, Tortuga. But beyond the Caribbean, one of the prime hubs for 17th and 18th century pirates was the Indian Ocean. There was a so-called pirate route, a route starting in America, sailing around the Cape of Good Hope, targeting merchant ships near the coasts of Yemen and India. This wasn't just a quick raid around the corner. It was a global operation. Thousands of nautical miles, months spent in open ocean, crossing climate zones from tropical heat to the roaring 40s. A captain from Rhode Island could easily be plundering the caravans of the Mughal Empire off Madagascar, then sailing back to New York, a small colonial port back then, to sell Indian silk to local merchants. Piracy was a worldwide enterprise long before the word became trendy. Now, let's talk about clothing. Leather knee-high boots, a long coat embroidered with gold, a tricorn hat with a feather. This is my favorite example of how movies rewrite history after the fact. Pirates of the Golden Age didn't wear long frock coats. They chose practical, loose clothing,
baggy pants and short jackets that wouldn't snag on rigging. Bare feet gripped the wet deck better than leather soles. When they could, sure, they wore fancy, expensive clothes, but only when they'd taken them from their victims, not from a catalog, but by chance. A captain might sport a governor's wig over a salt-stained shirt. It wasn't fashion, it was a trophy. But the most persistent myth isn't about clothing or geography. It's about ships. Cinema loves to show massive, multi-deck frigates lined with rows of cannon ports. They look impressive, but such a ship is a nightmare for a pirate. A large frigate needs a crew of 200 to 300 people. They have to be fed, watered, and cared for. It's slow. It stands out from miles away, and it can't navigate shallow waters. Most pirates preferred small, fast, and agile vessels, sloops, brigs, cutters. A ship with a crew of 40 to 60 that could close in on a merchant before anyone had a chance to raise the alarm, then vanish among the islands where a Royal Navy frigate would run aground on a reef. It's like comparing an armored cash truck to a motorcycle during rush hour. The motorcycle wins every time. Now, let's get to the heart of the matter, the real reason this all began. What was the top priority loot? Of course, a chest filled with gold doubloons. Of course, heaps of emeralds and rubies. Of course, a treasure map marked with an X in just the right spot. No, for pirates, the priority wasn't gold or precious gems. It was supplies essential for survival. Food, clothing, navigation tools, carpentry gear, and, most importantly, medicine. Because on a ship that might not touch port for months, scurvy killed more reliably than cannon fire. A wounded arm, left untreated by a surgeon, could turn gangrenous in just 3 days. Venereal diseases, tropical fever, dysentery. These illnesses wiped out entire crews by the dozens. Gold on a deserted island is worthless, but mercury ointment and quinine bark could mean the difference between life and death. Here's a vivid example, one that, to me, outshines any pirate novel. It's 1718. Blackbeard, Edward Teach, stands as history's most iconic pirate. He wove slow-burning fuses into his beard and lit them before battle, shrouding his face in smoke. 6 pistols strapped across his chest. He crafted this terrifying image deliberately, turning himself into a living nightmare. Why? Because a ship that surrenders out of fear doesn't need to be stormed. No losses, no damage. Teach wasn't just a fighter, he was a master of fear as a weapon. And then this man blocks the port of Charlestown, one of the largest harbors in the British colonies. He takes hostages, he makes demands. A chest full of gold? A ransom paid in coins? Jewels? Nothing like that. Blackbeard demanded a crate of medical supplies. A crate packed with bandages, mercury treatments, and surgical tools. And the town paid up. Because for someone living out on the open sea, that crate was worth more than all the silver from Potosi combined. When, in 1996, they raised the wreck of his flagship, Queen Anne's Revenge, from the seabed off the coast of North Carolina, the discoveries included syringes, urethral sounds, and surgical instruments. Not chests of coins, medical equipment. Here's an intriguing twist. The most famous pirate in history, whose name became synonymous with sea robbery, brings an entire city to its knees, all for a medical kit. Hollywood would have rejected this script at the pitch stage. Where's the gold? Where's the drama? But the real drama is here. A man who knows his crew won't die from bullets, but from infection, and acts accordingly. No romance, pure calculation. And you know what really stands out? It's not the Hollywood embellishments. Those are expected. That's the entertainment industry at work. What's striking is how changing the motivation completely shifts how we see these people. When the pirate hunts for treasure, he's an adventurer, a romantic, a rebel. When he's after quinine and bandages, he becomes a survivor in a world where every day could be his last. It's not a glamorous story, but that's exactly why it's real. Here's something interesting. If the entertainment industry can turn hard-nosed realists into carnival characters over a couple of centuries, politics moves even faster, and with much fresher material.
Sometimes, just one generation is enough to transform geopolitical bargaining into a battle of ideals. On September 11, 1973, a military coup rocked Chile. General Augusto Pinochet overthrew the democratically elected socialist president Salvador Allende. The presidential palace, La Moneda, was bombed from the air by the country's own air force. Allende died that very day. Just weeks later, Washington recognized the new government. The nation that called itself the leader of the free world and a bastion of democracy openly backed a military dictatorship. Not secretly, not with shame, but openly. This is where we have to pause and ask the uncomfortable question: what was the Cold War really about? The standard answer is familiar to anyone who's ever cracked open a school textbook: capitalism versus communism. Freedom versus tyranny. Two value systems locked in an uncompromising battle for humanity's future. It's a neat, symmetrical picture, simple and clear, except it doesn't hold up to the facts. The Cold War wasn't just an ideological clash. It was a high-stakes geopolitical showdown between two superpowers. The United States and the Soviet Union fought over spheres of influence, resources, control of trade routes, and military bases. Ideology? It served the same purpose as a pirate flag on a mast, intimidating, rallying support, and shaping the image of the enemy. But beneath the surface, a very different cargo lay hidden. Let's take a closer look at this load. The United States, often seen as a stronghold of democracy and human rights, supported about 35 dictatorships around the world during the Cold War. Pinochet in Chile, Suharto in Indonesia, Mobutu in Zaire, the Shah in Iran. None of these leaders had anything to do with democratic values, but they were all fiercely anti-communist, and that was enough. More than that, in 1972, Richard Nixon flew to Beijing and shook hands with Mao Zedong, the #1 communist on the planet, the man behind the Cultural Revolution, and the leader of the country that had declared communism the greatest threat to civilization, sat down with him at the negotiation table. Because China served as a valuable counterweight to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union operated in a mirror image. This was the country of the victorious working class, where private ownership of the means of production had been wiped out by the Constitution. Yet it struck major economic deals with capitalist corporations. In 1966, the Italian company Fiat signed an agreement to build a car factory in Togliatti. Capitalists built factories for the communists, using communist money. West Germany, a member of the North Atlantic Alliance and the front line of the so-called Free World, became one of Moscow's largest trading partners. Gas, pipelines, loans. There was no iron curtain when it came to business. What emerges is a picture where the disaster, or rather the illusion, has many creators. Ideologues on both sides crafted the image of an irreconcilable enemy. The military justified their budgets. Politicians wielded fear to unite their people. Meanwhile, diplomats and businessmen quietly signed deals that completely contradicted the public rhetoric. No side acted with genuine conviction or consistency. Both played the same game, and both knew it. But wait, if this confrontation was so pragmatic, was it even continuous? After all, we're told about 50 years under the shadow of nuclear threat, half a century balancing on the edge. No, the conflict wasn't a solid block. It had massive cracks running through it. From 1953 to 1964, the so-called Khrushchev thaw. Delegation exchanges, joint scientific projects, a relative easing of tensions. Then, from 1969 to 1979, a stretch known simply as détente. Treaties limiting strategic weapons took shape. In 1975, the joint space mission, Apollo-Soyuz, lifted off. Astronauts and cosmonauts shook hands in orbit, right in the middle of what was supposed to be a deadly standoff between two rival systems. And now, the finale. Ask anyone, when did the Cold War end? The usual answer is 1991, the year the Soviet Union collapsed. But that's not quite right. The conflict actually began to fade in 1987, when Mikhail Gorbachev announced his policy of new thinking and started dismantling the confrontational system from within. Legally, it was the Paris Charter for a New Europe, signed in November 1990, that marked the official end. 34 countries declared the confrontation over. The Soviet Union still existed then. It would last another year. The Cold War and the Soviet Union's collapse, two separate events we often blend into one. You might think that, cynical as it was, this system at least kept the peace. Nuclear deterrence, a balance of fear. Two bears in the same den don't fight because the whole thing would blow up. The idea of a long peace, it's beautiful, elegant, and comforting. And it's completely false. From 1945 to 1970, the world saw 176 wars. 176. That's 7 wars every single year. Every 52 days, a new armed conflict ignited somewhere on the planet. Korea, Vietnam, Algeria, Congo, the Indo-Pakistani Wars, the Arab-Israeli Wars, civil wars in Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia. Nuclear weapons didn't stop war. They stopped war between just 2 specific countries. Everywhere else was burning. Let's take a moment to unpack a word we use every day without thinking about where it comes from. Third world. Today, it's a shorthand for poverty, backwardness, and hardship. When we hear third world countries, the image that flashes in our minds is of dusty roads, crumbling huts, and humanitarian aid. But that wasn't the original meaning. The first world referred to the United States alliance. The second world was the Soviet Union's bloc. And the third world was made up of countries that refused to side with either. India, Yugoslavia, Egypt, Indonesia. They formed the non-aligned movement, deliberately choosing not to pick a side. This was a political stance, not an economic label. Yet in the language of the Cold War victors, the ones dividing the world into first and second, the third world automatically became a synonym for worst. A simple ranking turned into a condemnation. This is what happens when geopolitical labels are left unchecked. They gather meanings they never had, shaping the minds of millions. Terms born in diplomats' offices turn into badges that entire nations wear for decades, unaware that these labels once meant something completely different. This cynical process, crafting a polished cover for cold calculation, slapping on a label, and waiting for it to become part of the skin, doesn't just happen on the level of superpowers. Sometimes it engulfs a whole country, burying its true contribution to history beneath layers of unfair jokes and caricatures. There's a joke online that's been around for nearly 20 years. White flag, raised hands, surrender without a fight. The target of the ridicule? One of Europe's oldest powers, a country that literally reshaped the world map. But if you type its name into a search engine along with the word war, the first results you'll see are memes about surrender. Not victories, not conquests, memes. And here's the uncomfortable question. What if this entire reputation as military losers rests on just one single episode that lasted only 6 weeks? But before we dive into those 6 weeks, let's take a look at what came before, because the scale is staggering. By the middle of the 18th century, France controlled territories stretching from Quebec in Canada all the way down to the swamps of Louisiana. That's, for a moment, a third of North America. Then came Western and Equatorial Africa, Senegal, Mali, Chad, Congo. Next, Indochina, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. The islands of Oceania, Madagascar, Algeria. By the early 20th century, the French colonial empire spanned nearly 12 million square kilometers. That's more than the entire modern continent of Europe, twice over. The French tricolor flew over ports on 4 continents, with trade routes running from the Atlantic coast of Dakar to the Mekong Delta. Cowards, you say? Cowards don't build the second largest colonial empire in history. Cowards don't hold on to it for a century and a half. Let's take a step back to a moment that's often misunderstood, the French Revolution. Schoolbooks make it seem simple. Starving peasants grabbed their pitchforks and marched to overthrow the king. Crowds, bread, the guillotine. But hold on. Who actually sat in the National Assembly in 1789? Lawyers, notaries, financiers, factory owners, the educated middle class, legal experts, bureaucrats, bankers, known as the so-called Third Estate. These people weren't starving. They earned more than half of the nobility. Yet they had no political rights, the kind of privileges nobles gained just by birth. The revolution wasn't driven by empty stomachs. It was fueled by full pockets that had no voice. The peasants provided the firepower, but the spark came from those with legal training.
Let's be honest, friends. When we reduce a complex event to a single image, a hungry mob storming the Bastille, we don't just lose the details, we lose the whole mechanism behind it. Without that mechanism, history turns into a joke you can retell over lunch, but from which you can't draw a single lesson. Now let's talk about those 6 weeks that wiped everything else out. May to June, 1940. German tank columns break through the front line across the Ardennes forest. 6 weeks later, and Paris falls. How? Why? The answer that stuck in the popular imagination is almost cartoonish. The French were cowards. They surrendered without a fight. But that has nothing to do with reality. In 1940, France had one of the largest armies in Europe. They had more tanks than Germany, roughly 3,200 compared to 2,400 German tanks. Artillery, fortified lines, experienced officers, they had it all. There wasn't a single up-to-date doctrine. The French General Staff prepared for a war that had already ended 20 years earlier. Trenches, positional defense, the Maginot Line, concrete fortifications stretching hundreds of miles, costing billions of francs. The generals thought in terms of 1918. But the Germans launched a blitzkrieg, a focused strike with armored spearheads at the weakest points, backed by air support and radio communication between units. French tanks were scattered thinly along the front, like butter spread over a massive slice of bread. German tanks were concentrated into a fist and driven into a single point. This wasn't cowardice, it was a strategic disaster. Generals fighting by yesterday's rules faced the war of tomorrow. This is where a powerful meme was born. One strategic blunder, 6 weeks of disgrace, and that was it. Centuries of military victories, from the 100 Years' War to the Napoleonic conquests, from colonial expansion to the Battle of Verdun, where in 1916 the French army held their ground for 10 months at the cost of 300,000 lives, all erased. Left behind was a caricature of a white flag. A single local failure wiped away centuries of achievements. And what's striking is that the meme survived every attempt to debunk it. No matter how many historians explain the causes of the 1940 disaster, the image of raised hands keeps spreading online. Because a joke is simpler than the truth. A joke fits into a headline. The truth demands a whole paragraph. But we could have stopped there, if not for one more fact that these jokes completely bury. After Paris fell, after the pro-German Vichy government took power, the French resistance operated throughout the entire occupation. Guerrilla groups, underground networks, sabotage on railroads, passing intelligence to the Allies. These weren't isolated acts of desperation. This was an organized fight that lasted 4 years, from 1940 to 1944. The state surrendered. The people did not. We've gone through dozens of examples where facts get replaced by fiction. Now it's time to understand why our brains are so quick to accept these falsehoods. Because the truth is uncomfortable. Physically uncomfortable. It doesn't fit into a catchy phrase, won't squeeze onto a poster, and can't be tucked into a photo caption. We've journeyed from ancient economies, where bartering turned out to be a textbook invention, to 20th century geopolitical myths, where 6 weeks of military defeat buried centuries of victories. We explored how nations remember selectively, how one vivid image can erase 1,000 dry facts, and how anecdotes beat statistics every time. The scale of shattered illusions stretches from Mesopotamia all the way to the Cold War. And here's what's fascinating. None of these myths survived because of a conspiracy. None were forced on billions of people by some secret group hiding in a dark room,
deciding what they should believe. Each one took root on its own, like a weed thriving in fertile soil. So now, we need to take a step back and figure out what kind of soil that is. The human brain isn't a hard drive. It doesn't store information as files that you can open and check. Instead, it stores stories. In 2010, neuroscientists at Princeton ran an experiment where they scanned listeners' brains while someone told a story. When the story was coherent and emotionally engaging, the listener's brain activity actually synced up with the storyteller's, neuron by neuron. But when the same facts were presented as a dry list, that synchronization vanished. The brain simply tuned out. Put simply, we're biologically wired to believe stories, not spreadsheets. And this isn't a bug. It's a feature that's been around for 100,000 years. When our ancestors sat by the fire telling stories about a saber-toothed tiger lurking beyond the hill, he didn't need to present peer-reviewed research. A vivid story was enough. Those who believed the tale and avoided the hill survived. Those who demanded proof did not. Natural selection, over millions of years, favored brains that clung to narratives faster than to facts. You'd think that with the rise of science, statistics, and the internet, this ancient habit would fade away. But the opposite happened. The more information there is, the harder our brains hold on to simple explanations. It's like trying to drink from a fire hose. When the data overwhelms you, the only way to stay afloat is to grab onto one clear story and hold tight. But wait, if myths are just the product of a lazy brain, then why do educated people believe in them just as much, sometimes even more, than those with less schooling? Why can a history professor fully understand that a barter economy never truly existed, yet still teach it to students? Because a myth isn't just a mistake, it's social glue. Shared misconceptions do what no constitution can. They create a sense of shared reality. When an entire nation believes the same simplified story about its past, whether heroic, tragic, or anything else, that belief becomes the foundation of identity. We are the ones who endured that. We are the ones who defeated those. We are heirs to a great tradition. It doesn't matter that that was more complicated, that those weren't exactly as portrayed, or that the great tradition was mostly invented in the 19th century. I have to admit, I struggled for a long time to understand why people fiercely defend myths that don't accuse or excuse them personally. What difference does it make whether barter came before money or not? Then it hit me. The difference lies in the worldview. If barter existed, that means markets are natural. Capitalism springs from human nature. Everything is unfolding as it should. But if barter never existed, then the economic system you live under isn't the only way. And that thought? That's genuinely unsettling. In other words, the myth isn't defending the past, it's defending the present. Here, society becomes an accomplice, not a victim of deception, but an active participant. The school teacher simplifies history into a neat, easy-to-follow story. The journalist opts for a flashy headline instead of accuracy. The politician cites historical lessons that never existed in that form. And the viewer? They share a meme of a white flag because it's funny, but digging into the strategic mistakes of 1940? No thanks. Each one acts logically within their own role, yet every single one adds another brick to the wall of collective misunderstanding. There's no single culprit. Everyone shares the blame, one after another. This is why directly debunking a myth almost never works. Psychologists call this the backfire effect. When people encounter facts that challenge their beliefs, they don't change their minds. Instead, they dig in deeper. The brain treats an attack on a belief as an attack on identity, and it flips on a defense mechanism, the very one that kept our ancestors safe from saber-toothed tigers 100,000 years ago. Only now, the tiger is inconvenient statistics. You could write 20 scientific papers proving medieval people didn't believe in a flat earth. You could make 40 videos showing that Napoleon was average height. You could publish every document, every original source, every piece of data. The myth would outlive them all. Because a meme takes 3 seconds to consume, but a refutation demands 20 minutes. 20 minutes people have to be willing to spend. Facts don't lose to myths because they're weaker. They lose because they're playing a completely different game. A myth answers the question, who are we? A fact answers the question, what happened? And the first question will always matter more to the human brain than the second. Always. This isn't a personal flaw. It's built into our very nature as a species. If we understand that history is a construct, woven from convenient simplifications, emotional needs, and mental traps, then one question remains. What do we do with that knowledge right now? Let's start with a simple experiment. Tomorrow morning, when someone at breakfast says, people in the Middle Ages only lived to about 30, don't just nod along. Ask where they got that idea. Not aggressively, not condescendingly, just ask. Then watch what happens. 9 times out of 10, the person will freeze for a moment, then say something like, well, that's common knowledge. Common knowledge. That phrase, that's the foundation beneath every myth we've been unpacking today. It's not some malicious scheme, not a dark conspiracy, just common knowledge, period. But wait, if we strip away common knowledge, what are we left with? If medieval people weren't backward savages, if the French didn't surrender at the first shot, if half of what we know about the past comes from jokes, internet memes, and lousy textbooks, then what exactly are our current beliefs built on? Here's where things get tricky. We base political decisions on so-called lessons from history that never really happened. We vote based on comparisons that don't hold up. We judge entire nations by stereotypes stitched together from scraps of century-old jokes. It's like building a house on a foundation made of paper mache. It looks solid until the first rain falls. Friends, I'm about to say something that might sound harsh, but here's my take. Our willingness to believe in simple historical narratives isn't ignorance, it's comfort. The brain hates complexity. It craves a story with clear heroes and villains, causes and effects, a beginning and an end. A world where Rome fell because of moral decay, Napoleon lost because of the cold, and the Middle Ages were just dark. This world makes sense. You can grasp it in a few seconds. Reality, though, doesn't fit so neatly. Reality is 17 factors, 3 of which contradict each other, and not a single historian can say which one really tipped the scales. That's uncomfortable. So the brain chooses comfort instead. You'd think that in an age where anyone can verify a fact in 30 seconds with a phone in hand, myths would have died out. But the exact opposite happened. Myths have only multiplied. They spread faster, they mutate, adapt, and take on new shapes. By the year 2000, old misconceptions lived in books, passed down from generation to generation. By 2020, they spread within hours through social media and short videos. By 2025, artificial intelligence generates them, and distinguishing a fabricated historical photograph from a real one becomes a job for experts with specialized equipment. The pace at which myths are created has outstripped the speed of their debunking, and the gap keeps widening. But here's what really matters. The goal isn't to become a walking encyclopedia who corrects everyone at every party. The goal is something else. Every time you catch yourself thinking, well, that's obvious, stop. Right in that moment, you're at your most vulnerable. Because what seems obvious is exactly what nobody questions. And what nobody questions becomes the perfect hiding place for lies. We started with the question, why do people so easily believe historical myths? The answer turned out to be unsettling. It's because that's how we're wired. Our craving for simple explanations isn't a flaw. It's a feature that helped our species survive for 100,000 years. Only the world has changed, and our mental software hasn't. Here's the final question I want to leave you with. It's not about the past. It's about the present. Right now, as you listen to this, which myth do you believe? Not a medieval one, not a Napoleonic myth. Something modern, something from today. A myth so obvious you never thought to question it. It's there. It definitely is. You just haven't discovered which one yet. And when you do find it, because you will if you start looking, you'll realize one thing. Letting go of a comfortable illusion doesn't make the world simpler. It makes you freer. And that might just be the only lesson from history that truly holds up.